Michael Walzer, the great political philosopher, once said that the challenge of America is to embrace its differences and maintain a common life. And that's the theme of my talk. It's going to be democracy and diversity. And I want to tell you when diversity kind of first made a powerful impression upon my life and on the way and the work that I do and the way that I decided to live my life. It's my first day on the campus of the University of Illinois, 15 or 16 years ago. I walk into the gym to play basketball, and I notice that there are 3 games going on. There's a black game, there's a white game, and an Asian game. And I'm asking myself, which game am I going to play in? And I realized something. All of my life, growing up in the western suburbs of Chicago, I have played in the white game. And not only that, I have shed the other parts of myself. I refused to learn Indian languages growing up. I refused to learn Indian cooking in order to play in the white game. And my whole college career after that became about the challenge of racial diversity, ethnic diversity. Why is it that some people feel so marginalized because of their color and because of their ethnic heritage? And I would go home and I would regale my father about, we're Indian, and why is it that we don't have more friends who are people of color? Why is it that you chose to move to Glen Ellen instead of moving to Rogers Park in Chicago with more Asians, et cetera, et cetera. This was because I was 18 and in college, and all of this head full of kind of radical spangles was what I had. This would all be kind of combined with the class critique of my father, and I would go home and, my dad banned the word bourgeois from the house. I couldn't come home for Thanksgiving if I wanted to use that word. My dad looked up at me my second or third year in college and said, Eboo, I understand what you're saying. He said, I'm not stupid. I'm one of the first Indians in a senior position in corporate advertising in Chicago. And I started at Leo Burnett in the late 1970s. I understand exactly what you're talking about. But it strikes me that whenever you talk about diversity, you talk about race, ethnicity, gender, class, sometimes sexuality. These things are all hugely important. But do you not read the newspaper? Do you not watch the evening news? Because the type of diversity you never talk about is the type that's blowing the world up, and that's religion. And he was right. This was the mid-1990s, and as I started paying attention to the news and reading the New York Times, it was religious conflict in the Balkans. It was religious conflict in Northern Ireland. It was religious conflict in the Middle East. In the mid-late 1990s, India explodes a nuclear bomb, calls it the Hindu bomb. Pakistan explodes a nuclear bomb, calls it the Muslim bomb. In sociology classes in college, in dorm room discussions, the word religion and religious diversity might have come up, 5 times throughout my whole college career. I thought to myself, why are we missing out on one of the great stories of this era, which is that it seems that too often when people from different religious communities gather in close quarters, there's conflict. I started kind of paying attention to that narrative, and I noticed that, my gosh, the 1990s was in some ways a decade of religious violence. You have the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. That's an early al-Qaeda move. Of course, you have the growth of al-Qaeda during the decade. In 1995, you have the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by Yigal Amir. You have continuing conflict in Sri Lanka. You have the Omagh bombing in Northern Ireland. It's very much a decade of religious violence, but this is not a narrative that's particularly strung together by the diversity or the multicultural movement. And then something else occurred to me, and it kind of came to me like a flash one morning, that so many of my heroes, and I was not a particularly religious person in college, but so many of my heroes, and I imagine that many of these are your heroes also, Dorothy Day, Jane Addams, Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Desmond Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, Fareed Essek, Malcolm X, Badsha Khan, the list goes on and on. Many of the heroes of the 20th century were people of faith. And faith was not ancillary to who they were. It was who they were. King said in his famous speech against the Vietnam War in 1967 at Riverside Church, he said that higher to me than any commitment to nation or to race or to creed is the idea of my sonship to Jesus Christ. That is who I am. He said, people make of me many things, but at bottom, I'm the son of a Baptist preacher and I'm the grandson of a Baptist preacher. And it is that tradition that calls the tune that I follow. I noticed one more thing, that so many of the acts of violence committed in the name of God to the soundtrack of prayer in the 1990s were committed by young people. Yigal Amir, the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, is 26 years old. Benjamin Smith, a guy who goes on a rampage through the Midwest, killing Jews, African Americans, and Asian Americans in the name of the World Church of the Creator, part of the Christian identity movement, is like 21 years old. You start asking yourself, and you think about this, right? Like when you read the newspaper today and you see stories about religious violence, you just expect to see an 18-year-old associated with it, or a 24-year-old. It's almost like, you don't even, it's just kind of written into the DNA of the human race that it's going to be young people who are on the front lines of religious violence. And then something else occurred to me. You know how old King was in Montgomery when he led the bus boycott? 26. How old was Gandhi when he started his movement against racist pass laws in South Africa? 24. How old was Jane Addams when she started Hull House? 28. How old was the Dalai Lama when he leads his people out of occupied Tibet into India? Barely out of his teens. I'm 19 years old, right? I see the world, admittedly, in a somewhat black and white way. But effectively, what I'm seeing is an era where young people are on the front lines of religious violence, and I'm looking at previous eras where young people were on the front lines of being faith heroes. And I noticed something else, that what's at the center of religious violence? The destruction of people different from you. Who did Benjamin Smith kill? Jews, African Americans, and Asian Americans in the name of white supremacy, grounded in a perverted notion of Christian theology. What does Osama bin Laden say? Kill the Jews and the Crusaders and the Muslims who are not like us. Religious extremism is profoundly grounded in the notion that only my people should dominate and everyone else should suffocate. And what did our faith heroes do? They built movements of religious pluralism. What makes King, Gandhi, Bacha Khan, Mandela, Tutu, what makes these people remarkable is not just that they led movements for their own religious community or racial community, but that they led movements that built societies where everybody could live in what I call equal dignity and mutual loyalty. Just a quick story of King here. In 1950, King is a 20-year-old seminary student, Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He travels on a spring night to Philadelphia to hear a great intellectual, Mordecai Johnson, give a talk on Christian pacifism. Who is the embodiment of Christian pacifism that Johnson talks about? A Hindu from India named Mahatma Gandhi. And King doesn't think to himself, well, gosh, my Christianity means I got to oppose that guy because he's a Hindu. King thinks to himself, gosh, there's something deeply embedded in Gandhi's Hinduism that connects to a deeply embedded value in my Christianity. That's the notion of love and nonviolence. And 5 years later, when King leads the bus boycott, he says that for him, it's Christ who furnishes the inspiration and Gandhi, an Indian Hindu, who furnishes the method. Right? 4 years later, King takes the idea of religious diversity so seriously. This, again, is not ancillary to who he is. It's central to who he is. He goes to India to study Gandhi's movement. And what he finds is that it's not just a Hindu movement. Satyagraha, Truth Force, is a movement of Sikhs and Jains and Buddhists and Christians and Hindus and Muslims and non-religious people. In fact, Gandhi's closest companion in Satyagraha was probably a Muslim, Bacha Khan, often called the Frontier Gandhi. King comes back to Montgomery, Alabama, steps up in the pulpit of a provincial church in the American South, and the year is not yet 1960, and he speaks these words, "O God, we call you this name. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you the unmoved mover. I mean, think about the vastness of that interfaith consciousness at that time. In 1963, King comes to Chicago to give one of his famous speeches at the Chicago Conference on Religion and Race. He quotes from the Hebrew prophets, Amos in particular, "Let justice rain down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." And in the back of that room is an Orthodox rabbi, barely escaped Hitler's death camps in Eastern Europe, Abraham Joshua Heschel, 6 weeks away from being burned at Auschwitz. And he listens to King, and he says, the soul of Judaism is at stake in this movement. And 2 years later, he marches with King in Selma. He's the guy with the big beard and that famous picture of King and the others at Selma. And afterwards, he writes, "It felt like my legs were praying." Right? That's America. You know, that's America. And I'm watching this happen. I'm watching this happen. And I'm thinking that there's this great line by W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar, 100 years ago. The problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And it was. And it is. But it's not the only problem in the 21st century. We also have a faith line in the 21st century. And the problem is how we define the faith line. And what I would like to suggest is that we have to import King's definition of the color line into how we view the faith line. Because Du Bois didn't ultimately define who the color line divided. It was King who offered the most insightful, powerful definition of that. And King said the color line does not divide white people and black people or Easterners and Westerners. The color line divides people who would live together as brothers and people who would perish together as fools. And the worst thing we can do is to define the faith line as Christians versus Muslims, or as secularists versus believers, because that will write us into an endless war. 1.3 billion Muslims on the planet and 2 billion Christians. Let me tell you something. You pit those two groups against each other, we're never going to stop fighting these wars. The only way to define the faith line in a way where everybody wins is to define it as pluralism versus totalitarianism. Pluralism is a one-line definition. Building a society where people from different backgrounds live in equal dignity and mutual loyalty. That's pluralism. Okay? Totalitarianism has a one-line definition. People who want only their group to dominate and everyone else to suffocate. Right? Our job in America and increasingly around the world is to try to nurture pluralism. When I got out of college, I decided this was the path that I wanted to follow. I was convinced that the faith line was going to be the central challenge of the 21st century, and I started going to interfaith conferences to try to figure this out. And what I saw at interfaith conferences, a lot of them in the Bay Area, by the way, I thought it was great. It was remarkable. It was, people talking about shared values between different religions, people speaking about interspirituality. But I looked around, and it was a lot of, frankly, senior theologians. It was the folks who run polls. It was older people. Now that's great, but I got to tell you something. If religious extremism is a movement of young people taking action, and interfaith cooperation is a movement of senior theologians drafting documents, we lose, right? We are at a point of a huge youth bulge around the world. 85% of the Palestinian territory is under 33. Median age in Iraq, 19.5. Over 60% of India and Pakistan, under 26. What are the religious identities of those young people going to be? And in the most interactional period in human history, where they're not just a Hindu in India, they're a Hindu in India knowledgeable about Jews in Israel, Christians in America, Muslims in Jordan, and they're asking themselves, who am I amidst all of these people? Who is not only helping shape their interaction, their identity, but their identity in interaction with others? And that's why I started this organization called the Interfaith Youth Corps, because I think that one of the most important things we can do right now is to have a movement around the world that says to young people who are somehow connected to a religious tradition. And by the way, that's about 3 billion people on the planet. right? If I'm like a marketing guy, I mean, that's like I'm salivating. That is a huge market, right? How do we make sure that their interactions with each other are going to lead to pluralism, are going to lead to societies where people live together in equal dignity and mutual loyalty? I want to tell you the dream of this organization. I was talking to Carl Pope yesterday. He's the head of the Sierra Club. He happens to be married to my aunt, so I get access to him quite often. And one of the things we were talking about was that the Sierra Club is not just an organization. The Sierra Club was the first institution in a movement and a field. If you walked around saying 120 years ago that you were an environmentalist, nobody would know what you were talking about. It didn't exist. It wasn't a category. It wasn't a term. Right? It took people like John Muir, who came to this part of the world about 100 years ago and said, show me someplace wild, went to the Redwoods and founded an organization called the Sierra Club and built a category called environmentalism, a field and a movement that put an idea into the culture. And the idea is that the earth is precious and needs to be protected. That's the goal of my organization. It's not just to build an institution, but to be the first institution in a field and a movement that says young people around the world need to be coming together in ways that build understanding and to serve others. And this is happening in Amman, and it's happening in Cairo, and it's happening in Bombay, and it's happening in Belfast. It's a big idea that's implemented in a variety of ways all over the world. I want to tell you something very scary. It's a paper that I read not long ago, done for the Carnegie Endowment. Religious extremism was built on philanthropy. Right? That it was the paper was about how these things get funded. Right? And this guy did research on this and said it's not particularly government money that's coming in, it's donors that are coming in. And what strikes me about the work that we do at the Interfaith Youth Corps is that if you say, I work in human rights, there are philanthropic categories called human rights. If you say, I work in environmentalism, there are philanthropic categories called environmentalism. But if you say, I work in interfaith cooperation, you better hope that the program officer likes you. Because there's no category. But why not? Why not in an age where people from different backgrounds are coming together more frequently and intensely than ever before, where young people are on the front lines of a clash of civilizations, where people increasingly think that the only way Muslims and Christians can interact is by killing each other, right? Why aren't we investing in the alternative, in movements, in forces, and institutions that are imagining a different world and then building it? I want to leave you with pieces of two poems. One, Gwendolyn Brooks, called Boy Breaks Glass. It's spoken as if she were a young person. She says, I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration. It's the power and the impact of young people. Which direction is it going to go? Second, A Ritual to Read to Each Other by William Stafford. I think American democracy all over the world depends on this ethic. If you don't take the time to get to know me, and I don't take the time to get to know you, then a pattern that others made may prevail in this world. And following the wrong God home, we could miss our star. Those who are awake, they must be awake now, or else a falling line may lull us back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, must be clear now. The darkness around us is deep. Jazakallahu khair. May God give you goodness.